Hi, this is Randall Schwartz, host of FLOSS Weekly. This week, Simon Phipps joins me. We're going to talk about OpenStax CNX, a great source for free textbooks for professors to use all over the world. You're not going to want to miss this, so stay tuned.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twit.
Bandwidth for FLOSS Weekly is provided by CacheFly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is FLOSS Weekly with Randall Schwartz and Simon Phipps. Episode 291, recorded April 23rd, 2014. OpenStax CNX. It's time for FLOSS Weekly, the show about free, libre, open source software. I am your host, Randall Schwartz, Merlin at Stonehenge.com, bringing you each week, or as often as I can, the movers, the shakers, the big projects, the little projects, the projects you might not have heard of, the projects you may be using every day and not know it. And I've got that memorized now. I haven't written it down for a long time. Anyway, so it's usually, I'm back in Santa Monica. You might recognize the tree from previous shows. I'm back at the people that are paying my bills, ZipRecruiter. And I'll probably continue to be coming from here for quite a while, as long as they're happy having me here, and they so far are. But we have a special treat today. We've got our co-host, Simon Phipps, in the Brick House. Simon, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much, Randall. Yes, I'm here in Petaluma. I'm taking a group of hackathon winners on a tour of Silicon Valley, and I have them here in the studio. They're sitting back here behind me. So wave and say hi, everybody. All in from Italy. They won an open data hackathon last autumn, and awesome. They're here meeting all sorts of companies.
Awesome. And of course, Petaluma is the Silicon Valley extreme north, right?
That's right, yes. Well, you know, when you define Silicon Valley as wherever there are geeks.
Well, that includes all the way back up to Portland and my home and stuff like that. So cool. All righty. Well, of course, the show is not about us. The show is about the show. And this week we have a wonderful show lined up. We're going to be talking about OpenStax CNX. And we're going to be bringing on in a few moments Ross Reedstrom and Kathy Fletcher, who are going to represent the project. It looks to me like this is an open university sort of thing, where they have a collection of curriculum, media, everything related to being able to teach various courses and stuff, and they've come up with a presentation system and actual content, and have content available under a nice Creative Commons license. At least that's what I could skim of it in the first 45 minutes that I had to play with this thing. Simon, what do you know about this so far?
Yeah, I know nothing about this. I've been reading the notes here, and it looks like a very long-lived project. Look, it's been going since 1999, so evidently it's meeting some needs there. I'll be interested to find out more about that.
Absolutely. Well, instead of us just contemplating what it's about, let's bring on some experts about it and actually ask some questions. That's probably a good way to do this. Ross Reedstrom, welcome to the show.
Hi.
And where are you speaking to us from?
I'm talking to you from Rice University, which is in Houston, Texas. I came here not long before the project started as a postdoc for a year or two, and as seems to often happen around here, I've been in Houston now for better than a decade or more. So
great.
Connections, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say also, let's go ahead and also bring on Kathy Fletcher, also representing the project.
Hi, I'm Kathy Fletcher, and I'm also in Houston at Rice University. And I was with the project a few years ago, and then I left for 3 years to do a fellowship, and I just got back. So
awesome.
I am excited to be here.
Cool. So Ross, why don't you go ahead and start and kind of give us the 30,000-foot view? What project is? What did I describe it well, or is there a lot more to it than what I'm talking about?
Well, you did better than a lot of people do on a first try. We've always suffered from not having a good elevator pitch because we're a project that falls in between things. We're an open education project. We're all about making content available for educational purposes, using technology to improve education. But probably the best way to talk about it is kind of do our origin story. Rich Baranuk is a professor at Rice University in electrical and computer engineering, ECE. He's an expert at digital signal processing, and he was about to teach an advanced graduate DSP class, and he could not find the right textbook. There were a couple textbooks that he wanted to use pieces of, but they were all $100 each, and he didn't want to make his grad students even poorer. So he thought, I just need to write my own book. So he went and talked to his dean, who was a friend of his as well, and also a DSP guy, and said, I'm going to write a book. And Sid said, Rich, you do not have 3 years to waste writing a textbook. Go do something clever with the web. And so Rich thought about that and talked to some of his grad students who said, well, maybe we can do the Linux open source-like thing, but for textbooks, which led to the original Connexions idea, which was exactly that. It's to have multiple people writing different parts and let you mix it together in the way you want it to present it to your students. And because they were DSP people, a critical piece of it was being able to do math well. So you couldn't just grab existing technologies, because at 1999, cast your mind back, that's, there was no Wikipedia. Google was about 2 years old, I think, at that point. MathML was a standard that existed, but nobody supported it. So they started this technology project with with a few undergrads over the summer. Weren't any better at naming things then than we are now. They called it the Secret Web Initiative. But that was the genesis of it. It was sharing content in an open way so that anybody could come in and put stuff in. And they decided to avoid the problem of becoming a publisher by saying, well, we're only going to take new stuff, and it has to be marked up in a way that it makes it easy to reuse. That was the key thing, was that every one of these professors wanted to put stuff in, but they wanted to reuse the other people's stuff, but have it still look good, have it be a quality product for their students, right? Because they're going to do this in place of a textbook. So it was textbook replacement materials, but better, so you could do good, do more advanced things with it.
Now, what do you mean by marked up? Is this something like tech or some other formatting?
Right. So the original thought was because there have been a lot of attempts to do technology education, and they tend to fall into two camps. You either have cool technology with toy data, or you have a pile of shared resources that are all everybody's Word files and PowerPoints and Excel spreadsheets, at best, or maybe some PDFs. So we're both. We're technology and content. And in order to make stuff remixable, back in the day, we chose our own XML markup called ConnexML. And I'll be talking about where we're at right now with our reimagining and rewrite. But that enabled us to use MathML with this layer on top. ConnexML is very lightweight. It's a bit like DocBook's XML specialization, although that didn't exist then at the time either. But it's even lighter. But it lets you specifically mark things as, for example, if there's an exercise in the middle of the text, very common for textbook materials, it's marked as an exercise, and it has an answer, right? It doesn't have a div and another div that might have a class on it, might not. So that when displaying it on the web, it's easy to do something cute and hide the answer until you click on it. When you generate that into a PDF format for textbook use, you can move the answers to the end of the chapter. When you access the site as a resource with a phone app, it can extract just the questions and do a little quiz for you. So that's the idea of the reuse, not just multiple people using it as textbooks, but also have content marked as meaning, semantically marked up content that can then be used for the future. We call it future-proofing the content. So you'd never have to bulk transform the stuff.
So you have essentially an XML schema that describes things that make a good sense for textbooks or for all learning materials. I don't know if textbooks is a subset of that.
Right. The original target was sort of any kind of educational content. Use different routes. Instead of having a particular book, the idea behind Connexions was to connect the content in a mesh, and so that you could have different routes through the content, different ways of learning. As we've built the content, we find that people tend to put in their one path. So we have more textbook-like series through, but people do remix and reconnect things. Now that's the then. The now is that we have in fact done one big mass retransform of the content because technology has caught up with us. The problem we ran into with being a specialized ConnexML was no one else wanted to use that. Well, that's not quite true. There have been a few other educational projects, one in Vietnam, one in South Africa that Kathy can talk about a little bit, that have been adopted our ConnexML and have been doing things with it. But it's been hard to mix with other technologies. but HTML5 came along. And some of the idea of the semantic web got integrated enough that we decided it was time to go ahead and do one big transform. And we accomplished that end of last year here before Christmas. We took all the existing content and retransformed it into an HTML format. And that's what we currently see live now at cnx.org. In actuality, because we're still working on the input half, we're fixing up our editor component, which ends up being a really critical piece for this use case, because our target users are not the technologically savvy people who will happily do markup. We have to hide the angle brackets from them.
Yeah.
So we still have the legacy site live, actually, and so we're doing a incremental upgrade. We're breaking things up into pieces and lifting them up one at a time. Okay, so
Now HTML though, HTML5 is still mostly presentation based though. Where do you then add the things like this as an exercise? Are you doing that with classes?
Well, we're both, not so much the classes. Actually, there are extensions to allow data dash attributes.
Oh, right.
And microdata formats. There have been a number of approaches to try and put the semantic information into the content. So that's the kind of back end, the model, right? We need this data to be this archive. In fact, that's what we call it now. Archive CNX.org is just the back end that just serves up the content.
Okay.
And after,
what?
Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I will talk forever unless you interrupt me.
That's actually fine for me. The fewer questions I can ask in an hour, the better I actually think the show goes. So it's fine. What I was going to ask you is what brought you to the project, and what's your current involvement with it?
Okay, yeah. I came to Rice as a postdoc in computational biology. Actually, by training, I'm a molecular biologist. And I spent many years as sort of but computers have always been my hobby. So I was always the computer guy among the biologists. And looking around, I saw some interesting things going on over in the computer science building. Went and started talking to people and ended up jumping the fence to become a biologist among the computer people. And worked on some research projects. There was something involving NASA for a little while. And as often happens in academia, grants run out, things come out. And this project got started about the same time that I was starting to look for a next slot. And I had a reputation as being sort of the open source guy in the building. So if you're going to talk open source, go talk to Ross. I'd been using Linux from back when I was a grad student, and I had to install Debian from a pile of floppies that was this high. Because I got tired of the computer crashing and losing my data that I just spent, stayed up all night to collect. So I said, yeah, this sounds like a great idea. I don't see why you can't apply open source principles to content as well as code. And to be honest, I was a little skeptical at first. I was like, is this really something that will last? But I said, well, I'll do it for a year or two. And that was, 12 years ago.
Wow.
Or longer now, 14, I guess.
Cool. And Kathy, same question. We don't have Ross answering all the questions. So what brought you to the project, and what's your current role?
Sure. So what brought me to the project was I was doing middleware software. If any of you know what that is, it is not the most exciting thing in the world to do. It's like connecting somebody's software to somebody else's software in a rational way. And I decided that I wanted to look at writing software that would be useful in education. It definitely had an interest in open source software for a long time. And that brought me to what Connexions was doing. They had already started this project. Ross was already there and lots of other people. And I loved what they were doing. This idea that you could have open textbooks, open courses, all of this material. If you think about it, algebra hasn't changed in hundreds of years. Why are we...
Uh-oh.
Did I freeze?
Yes,
yeah,
briefly.
just a little.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Right after algebra.
Yeah.
Algebra makes me freeze too.
Yeah, right. But it hasn't changed, right? Why are we spending $200 on algebra textbooks when this stuff hasn't changed in a long time? This stuff should be free. So that's what drew me to the organization. And then I was managing the team at that time and realized that the thing that was that was really holding the project back was that it was so hard to work with XML. It's great. It's great, but for educators who are the creators of this content, that is just not the way they want to create content. And so I spent 3 years on a fellowship testing out some ideas to make editing easy. Like, this really should be as easy as some of the HTML editors that are out there. The main thing that we need to do is preserve this structure, as we talked about earlier, for documents, and really make it look like just Google Docs or Word. Make editing that easy. And then when you want to do something a little fancier, like do an equation, have a special tool that does that for you in a very simple way. If you want to do something like a question that has a pop-up answer, you just drag and drop that in and add the structure there and make sure that it's all preserved so that you can still do all of the nifty things with production on the other side, other side of that. So that's what brought me into the project. What I'm doing now is a little bit is related, taking the content that Connexions and OpenStax have created. They've created textbooks for the most highly subscribed classes at the college level. And we are building software that helps students do more effective practice and learning. And that's what OpenStax Tutor is. So it's related and builds on some of that idea of, you've got this open content, you've got great structure in the content, so why can't you take all the exercises and problems that are in that and deliver those to students in a really effective way, such that at the end of the day, they actually remember what they've been learning.
Right. So this project, is this working as an open source style project where professors who pick up the material can improve it and contribute back the improved versions, or is the material that's in your archive pretty static and simply growing in volume rather than maturing?
So yeah, that's the exact magic of this, is that these textbooks that were created by a professional organization, they've now been adapted by faculty all over the country. It's very simple. Well, it's fairly straightforward to take a book.
Oh dear.
I'm back.
That momentary paralysis again.
Yeah.
You were saying it's fairly straightforward to take a book.
Take a book, create a copy, and if you think of it from the open source world, like GitHub or SVN or anything like that, you're making a copy and you're adapting it. And that's the idea, and that is occurring. And part of...
Can you complete that thought, Ross?
Yes. So it's easy to adapt and then make your copy available as well. That's one way we kind of differ from a Wikipedia for textbooks, is that everyone's not working on the exact same copy.
Right.
Because we're academics, it's a lot of it is about keeping your name on things. So you make a copy, and we've got college physics up there, and then there's college physics for University of Georgia, and they've made their own copy, rearranged it to fit their style of teaching and their educational calendar. And then, because it's broken into little modules, if they improve a section, then the people at UVA can take that and move that over into their copy of physics. So we end up with these clouds of content based on, and whichever one is the best ends up being just used the most.
So it's kind of like Git, where I make improvements and people then pull changes over into their version. So you don't have a master canonical version of the document. You've got this tree of different versions that people can pull content between.
Yeah.
Right. It's always been our model that we just publish everything. We don't edit things. We don't editorialize ahead of time. We don't vet the content coming in. Mm-hmm. The idea is that we do, in the academic world, we call it post-publication peer review. People decide what they like afterwards, and then that bubbles to the top.
So how does that all work from a licensing point of view? Because understanding who owns the copyright to what you're working on and what you're free to do with it is really complex in that sort of an environment. How does that work out for you? Right.
Very early on, we knew that was going to be a problem, because other projects that have tried to aggregate copyrighted materials have often fell victim to the massive costs of doing copyright clearance. So we decided right away that it would all have to be new content and would have to be under an open license. Now, the licenses didn't exist at the time, so we actually participated with Creative Commons in creating the Creative Commons licenses. So all the content in Connexions is CC BY.
Right, so it's just CC BY. There's no restrictions on commercial use, for example. I could take your content and publish paid-for textbooks with it.
As long as you properly attribute, which is amazingly how often people don't quite get that right. You will find it's difficult to sell the book for a lot of money because you have to point out the fact that there's a free copy right over there.
Right. So that's all CC BY. Do you? The copyright then remains the property of the author of the segment that you've got in the work. So does that mean that you have huge credit pages at the front of these documents?
Yes, actually, we pushed the credit pages to the end for that very reason, in the EPUBs at least. In reality, what ends up happening is you end up with 3 or 4 authors making each particular book. Kathy, you had a comment?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. That typically people work together in groups that they know outside, professional organizations or groups of faculty that work together or groups of teachers that work together. So the authorship doesn't tend to be 100 different authors for a particular book.
Okay. I'm interested that you don't appear to be using tech for anything, and I know that a lot of academic authors write their work in tech. Do you have any bridge between the world of tech content and your formats?
Well, particularly since I mentioned math, you might imagine that a lot of our professors who do math were interested in bringing that in. We do have some importers that work reasonably well. The problem with tech is that it's not semantic, so we tried to stay away from it as our primary markup. Our older legacy print pipeline did in fact transform out to tech, and for our professors who are experts at tech, they tell us it's the ugliest tech they've ever seen, this stuff that was computer generated on the way out to generate a PDF. Our current pipeline actually goes through DocBook as a step,
right,
in order to generate an HTML format. But all of that is sort of back-end pluggable things that we're replacing a little bit at a time. Now that we're in an HTML context, we take that plus CSS, CSS3 things to do just CSS and HTML to generate PDF and EPUB directly from that.
So now
Kathy,
this all sounds... Oh, Kathy, you carry on.
I wanted to add something about math. So, authors creating math, tech is the best way to do that. And the new editor respects that. So it's storing the actual tech that you use into the document, even though it's also creating...
She's phrasing again. Right, so we're taking advantage of other open source projects out there. Have you heard of MathJax?
Not heard of that one.
MathJax is pretty much how math is being done on the web these days. They're the compatibility layer for dealing with the fact that Firefox supports MathML, Chrome supports MathML, IE I think it does in 9 now. But all the different versions, MathJax is a in-browser JavaScript thing that manages to interpret the MathML coming in and then display it using HTML and CSS. And it has additional features of it can interpret various things. It can interpret LaTeX. It can interpret ASCII math, which is an even simpler way to input, just A plus B equals C sort of stuff. And we need to get to our editor question, because that's what we're currently working on. Kathy had mentioned it, and that's what she went off to do her fellowship for. We knew we needed a better editor, and we needed one that can be drag and droppy and things. And that was part of the push to move to a non-XML, because even though people have been using XML for decades, there isn't a good drag and drop XML editor that respects the semantics of the content. But the HTML editors were getting very good. And in particular, we use our own fork of Aloha, which you may have heard of. It's a in-browser, JavaScript-based HTML5 editor. And we've extended it, helped and cooperated with the Aloha project just as an external open source project. And we have done that as has OER Pub, which is Kathy's fellowship, to make it more semantic, allow for editing of these interesting types of things. And then the math becomes very easy because it uses MathJax, and you can just type in, and it maintains the form that the author created. That's one of the kind of important things is you don't want to transform stuff and then give back to the author something that they don't recognize and they can't edit it.
Right.
So yes, you can use tech, but you can use LaTeX just for the math parts, basically.
Right.
We're doing the rest of the markup in other ways.
So it isn't obvious that HTML5 is very semantically capable. So you must be adding a whole load of extra markup and GUI to let people add semantic markup to the text.
Well, that was the key thing, was that it's not that it's natively semantic, although there are some semantic tags already. You already have, I think it's note, but the main thing was that it allowed for arbitrary attributes, data dash attributes, which could then maintain the semantics. And other people had already done work with like microformats about doing exactly that, layering semantics onto the HTML.
Right. So it must be very hard when you're doing, for example, you earlier you mentioned that you were adding in capabilities about multimedia formats, and it must be quite hard to do the semantic tagging when you've got multimedia in there. So how are you fixing that?
Kathy, you've actually had your hands in the that piece of the editor more recently than I have, or at least Itzhak has, I think. I remember some discussion about getting the markup right on the plugin for putting in images and no?
Images, yes. I mean, we've done some work to specify how you would create proper attribution on those images and things like that. So the images are one thing, and also, creating them as part of a figure so that you've got the caption, you've got any accessibility information. It's all encapsulated into that same bit. And one of the ideas behind the editor is that it's embeddable. So we'd like other projects to be embedding the same editor and getting the same format back out, because it's HTML5, it'll work anywhere, but it is cleaner and more semantic because of the extra tagging that's going on there. For other kinds of multimedia, like video, we are mainly doing embeds, because that comes down to, does this project want to be a project that stores really, really large video and handles all the streaming? Probably not. You've already got YouTube, you've got Vimeo, you've got some other sites that can be used. And so by using clever plugins that use OEmbed to go and get that multimedia embedded into the editor, it's gone.
No, you're back again. So that break is a good break, because I wanted to ask you whether you've considered using Smile or another multimedia markup language so that you can add semantic tags to the multimedia content.
Not yet. That's an interesting idea.
Right.
Yeah, part of why we moved to HTML5 was so that we could enable those sorts of projects to happen more easily. You might imagine that after 12 years of working on this code, we had built up some technological debt. We had modified, we kept adding new features, and we had basically one monolithic app that did both, the editing, the display, the conversion to PDF and EPUB. Everything was one big project, and as you would try and add one feature or fix something else would break. So we managed to take advantage of the sudden interest in making textbooks free to siphon off a little bit of support for improving the infrastructure. As you know, no one ever wants to pay for infrastructure. So we're doing a mass rewrite, but doing it in an incremental way, so we can break the massive app into multiple components and use more modern technologies, not just the underlying markup, but the new web view, for example. I mentioned Archive does not do any of the layout for the web. It just provides the bare page. The layout is actually being done in the browser with a single page app written in JavaScript using, what are we using, Backbone, and I'm not the JavaScript guy, but we've got a couple people coding on that, and then we are now replacing the editor component of legacy with another in-browser JavaScript using Aloha and extending that feature, and then reaching over to a different backend service for doing the authentication, for example. Now you log in via Google or Facebook or a local account if necessary. breaking it all into these pieces is making it much easier to go ahead and add in a new technology without it breaking everything. So Smile looks very interesting. I've actually am a fan of the fact that SVGs allow for JavaScript activities in them. You may have seen that you can actually encode an entire presentation in a single SVG, and the browser will just render it. So I think those sorts of things are in the near future and moving forward.
And I'm curious now about the scope of this project. It sounds to me like this is primarily for instructors and lecturers to have a way of creating content and sharing content and building other people's content. Is there parts of this also about, say, classroom delivery and maybe even self-study, or is that outside the scope?
Okay. Well, I was wondering if Kathy wanted to jump in there, but it's no. Actually, the non-traditional learner has always been one of the important targets. Especially before this, we decided to start buying content and putting it in under the license. When we were mostly just the kind of grassroots content, we had a fair amount of electrical engineering content because that's what our founder was putting in and his friends. But we've had some music educators find us. In particular, there was one woman up in the University of Illinois, or in Illinois. She found out via someone she knew who was a professor at University of Illinois, who was a private music instructor, and she had all of her notes and write-ups and things for her students and for their parents, and was looking for a way to distribute them. And so she started actually learning the markup and putting it into our system. And for quite a while, we were one of the top hits in Google for things like circle of fifths. And we have content in there about how to play your trombone, and content for the parents about what to expect for your kids for their music practice. I have 2 kids now, and so I appreciate some of the educational side of the stuff more than I did when we first started. We find that our music education content is used by those sorts of people and then by retirees. They come back and say, you know, I did music as a kid and I'm getting back into it now. Thanks for all this, wonderful content. One of the, Rice University has a music school as well, the Shepherd School of Music. I've been told it's a top school. One of the professors there decided to create a course in Connections because he had this different way to think about, it's called sound reasoning, a different way to think about music appreciation. It's not his field of education. He teaches composition. And he got tenure as a composition instructor, but included his Connections work as part of his tenure package. And that's also some stuff that has been found by a lot of people and found to be interesting. We have all sorts of crazy... Go ahead.
I could jump in. I was just going to say, it's always been really an important goal of the project that all the content is there in all formats. Like, it's on the web. So, self-learners, people like that, it really, you can use all the content in the HTML format just using
the browser.
You can download it. You can download it as a PDF. You can read it on your ebook device, and all that stuff is immediately available. So that's one of the other things. The magic of the structure is that it can be produced live and be available in many different ways. People can use it in their learning management system. Connections is not trying to be a learning management system. It's not trying to track users or do any of the grading or any of that. But the content is available to be used in lots of different ways right away. No login required.
So it's sort of the first and third categories, then I was saying. Instructors, not delivery, but individual self-study people.
Yeah.
Cool.
Primarily, right. Although we have been used as the resource for a number of MOOCs. The one thing, we're not a MOOC. And the funny thing about many MOOCs is that they're not as open as you might think, because they still require a $200 textbook or various other things like that, where they're not as open as they could be. Whereas we provide those resources, the actual content.
And just in case anyone doesn't know what a MOOC is, MOOCs are these massive open online courses that MIT and Stanford and Rice University have been delivering and getting 10,000 students signing up. And they are absolutely free. The content's not necessarily open. Like, I couldn't necessarily take somebody else's MOOC and make it mine. So that's a little different. But there are also MOOCs that have been run out of the Connections and OpenStax content. So there's a lot of ties in between these different ideas and different projects.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was actually going to ask, how are you related to these other large projects like in iTunes U and a few other things like that? How are you related to all those? It sounds like you just answered that question, so thank you for clarifying that a little bit. What am I going to see if I'm, okay, so I'll make it personal for me. If I want to come to the site now and I want to say, do you have anything on computer science, and in what are the areas, what am I seeing at the site to be able to search for things like that?
Well, right now we basically have a search interface that gives you a factored. You would go in and search for computer science, basically, and we'll find things that have been categorized as that. We actually have a bunch of content for learning Java. That's from a professor over here at University of Austin Community College, I think. Mm-hmm. And to be honest, I do the back end. I don't actually get to sit and dig through the content that much. But basically, you will search, you will find, we've now called them books and pages. Excuse me. So there'll be a bunch of books, and you'll just see the titles and abstracts, and you can then filter them based on who the authors are or what year they were published. The typical sorts of, we're using the model of the kind of web store where when you start searching, you then get a sidebar with, I've forgotten the word for those kinds of factoring, facets of faceting the search. And then that will take you to the web pages, and the pages then have table of contents. You can walk through it, and there's a drop down to say get this book, and that will then give you links for the EPUB and the PDF. So,
or you can buy a print copy.
Or buy a print copy. That's been an interesting back-end technology story. There was a lot of interest in on-demand printing for a while, and we had a online print partner who decided to leave the business without bothering to tell us. So for a while, our buy a print copy links were completely broken. Right now, it's a little bit more. It's not quite as automatic. Not every single book has a link, but if the author chooses to, they can go set up a linkage through Lulu.
Cool.
And they can pull our PDFs.
Okay, so what I would ultimately get then is a PDF or an EPUB, or I could buy a hard copy of something. Okay.
Or just use it online, bookmark it.
Oh, okay, cool. And what's the technology driving the website? I might as well get geeky here because that's what the show's about.
Sure. Well, I said we're in the process of rewriting, but still our backends are mostly Python. We've broken it into multiple separate components. So we have a couple of them are pyramid-based. They're all WSGI web gateway things. So we have a Python backend, and then that's serving to a single-page app, as I said, written in JavaScript, and that's just being served via like Nginx because it's just a set of files. I just keep forgetting that there isn't a server for that part. I go to poke at that server, and there isn't one. It's just in the people's browsers. I'm too old. I find that amazing still.
Nginx is a perfectly valid server. Come on.
Okay, yes, yeah, right, Nginx. And we do put a copy of Varnish in front of that as a proxy reverse proxy cache. And we find that scales really, really well. We typically have millions of visitors a month. We're not completely top tier, but we're not a tiny little site either. And when we can keep our caching up in the 90%, it doesn't impact us at all, really.
Yeah, now I'm going to repeat a question that somebody in the chat room also addressed, which is, why is your search so slow?
That must be one of my colleagues.
No, I tried it myself, and I was sort of annoyed by that, so yeah.
Yeah, well, that's partly having to do with we haven't quite gotten to that bit for the rewrite. The search is a lot better if you go to the advanced search and limit yourself to certain fields. The search is trying to be a little too comprehensive and do something clever where it finds everything that could possibly match, just in case you typed in something that doesn't match our content at all, and eliminate that as a possible search component. And so you get to blame me, basically, why the search is so slow. It's another piece that needs refreshing. If you go in and say put Java into the title search, you will find that it's much, much faster.
Now, you're probably using a lot of reusable components from other projects like Nginx and things like that. And I understand using, at least the chat room talked about using Bootstrap and some other sort of projects related to that. Do you also are you creating reusable components that might not necessarily be about what OpenStax is doing, like the text editor extensions that you've talked about and other things? Do you have pieces that people can take away from this that aren't just about the content of the textbooks?
All of our code is up on GitHub, primarily under the Connections group, and also the OER pub group is where the editor stuff is. We tend to write, we scratch our own itch. We write things for ourselves, but we try and keep the thought of reuse for other projects in mind, particularly for the editor. Our back-end server components we serve out of a PostgreSQL database.
Nice. The right choice for that, that's what I was saying, Jeff. I like Postgres. Go ahead.
One of my colleagues just pinged me to take some of the onus off me on search. That actually right now an additional problem with search is that it'll get a lot faster if you get more specific with your search, because right now it loads the entire result set into the browser and renders the whole thing, right? And so if we just render the first few that you can see on the screen, it would appear to be a lot faster. So we'll fix that up really soon here.
A little bit of pagination there. And what license is the code that you've created under?
Our code is all under either GPL or AGPL. The newer kind of web-centric things are all AGPL.
Okay. Actually, I think Simon had a question to ask about that.
Sure.
Simon?
You've gone CC BY on all of your content, and yet your copyleft on your code. Is there a reason for that philosophical move?
Well, yeah, you can imagine that we had a lot of license discussions early on in the life of the project. The content, we basically had to, we wanted to keep the possibility of commercial use out there, partly because there have been court cases where taking something and going to the copy shop has been considered commercial use.
I wanted to jump in. I don't think commercial use is not the difference. Both the software license and the content license allow commercial use.
Oh, sure, you're right.
It's the share alike part. So you could have gone with a CC BY share alike license that would be closer to the copyleft software license that's out there. And I mean, I'll let Ross jump in too. I think one of the things was just CC BY was the simplest. And the
simplest to explain to our authors, yeah. Whereas we could be we're mostly dealing with, coders for the, on the code side, and they had been used to talking about licenses a bit more. I guess there was a concern that we wanted, as an open source project, we wanted to try and attract outside coders, and there was some concern that because the field that we're in is education and education software, it's dominated by big commercial players. There had been a few cases of projects kind of being taken private by hiring all the people coding on it and then taking the code base because it was closable, and there not being enough coders interested in continuing the free base. That in some sense we were thinking about the GPL as poisoning it slightly for that potential, keeping it free for the future. So no,
I find it quite fascinating because earlier on you talked about the content, and you talked about how it would be very hard to publish a commercial textbook because everyone would know that there was a non-commercial textbook. And yet you feel that the source code needs to have copyleft to protect it from commercialization. Now, keeping in mind, by the way, that commercial is not the opposite of open source. Proprietary is the opposite of open source. And all open source software is actually commercial. So I have to say that for one of our OSI board members who has a fixation about that problem. But I'm fascinated
I didn't say close the source. I didn't say
yeah, I'm fascinated that for your content you feel that the moral and community pressure will keep it contributed back, but for your source code you feel you have to compel people.
Partly that's kind of goes back to what Kathy said about, algebra hasn't changed. Last year's algebra textbook or 10 years ago's algebra textbook is just as good. Software has a much shorter shelf life. You will lose your user base to the closed branch. This is kind of my personal opinion. This is not necessarily something we sat around and agreed as an entire project on, but I was there for some of these discussions. And that was our thinking, actually. At the time, at least, that was my argument on it, was that it was more likely to disappear into one of the big publishers if it was BSD. There's a lot of BSD code in Microsoft.
My take would be a little different.
Sure.
My take would be a little different. Something like the editor, Aloha, was GPL v3. So we weren't, we picked it on the technical aspect of it. We did these.
Yeah, Kathy froze again, but she's making the point that a lot of the upstream projects that we use and participate in were already GPL, and so we kind of had to go that way. Some of them were Apache.
That does make sense. If you're going to reuse somebody else's stuff and you're building on somebody else's stuff, you really have to respect that license continuing forward. So that sort of forces your hand on some of the things. We're almost out of time, but I wanted to also look at the size of your community that are actually contributing code as opposed to just people contributing textbooks and using it as users. Is that mostly a tight-knit small group, or have you been getting contributions from outside your immediate organization?
Yeah, that's one area where we haven't been quite as successful as we would like. Especially, we've changed technology bases. We've always been Python. Well, not always. We go way back, but we were a big clone site for a long time, and we had some contributions then. Most of the code is written by people who are paid by Rice, either directly as employees or as contractors. Our code has always been out there and open, and especially now we're on GitHub. It's much easier for people to submit things. We have had other people using our code. There was a big deployment in Vietnam and some deployment in South Africa. And we've had, believe it or not, we had some contractors that we hired to write code. And then after they'd finished being paid, they continued to give us bug fixes and the occasional feature. So there hasn't been a huge community. We don't have hundreds of coders, but we're still out there and hoping to attract more. And that's partly why we're on this podcast today.
And breaking things into components has helped a lot with getting reuse. The editor in particular, there are several other projects using the editor and contributing back. There's a demo project with the editor called GitHub Book Editor. If you search for that, you can find it. And that's a full book editor that uses the GitHub API. Another Connexions developer, Phil Schatz, wrote a library to use the GitHub backend, and that's getting reuse also. So there are components that are getting nice reuse based on the GitHub code.
And Rice's motivation for this is that there's nothing else that fits the niche better, so they might as well pay you guys to continue to develop this bunch of code then, right?
Well, yeah, and also it's part of Rice's research. We're a research university, so we're funded via the typical kind of research university means, grants and donations. If you go to the About Us page at CNX.org, you will find, you go to people, the first thing you see is a whole page full of our donors rather than people. They're foundations primarily. We had some very early angel investors, effectively, who were board members at Rice, who thought this sounded like a really good idea, and they wrote personal checks. And then the Hewlett Foundation, and I'm going to forget people, so I need to stop. Go to that page.
Gates was one, right? Wasn't Gates one?
Yes, in the last couple of years, we've picked up Gates. Yep, Google has provided us some funds and some resources occasionally. The 20 Million Minds is another educational one. Anyway, so
yes,
go to the page.
They're all on the page. Go look at the page. Yes, that way we won't forget anybody. Send them to the page. Sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to plug one more because my fellowship was supported by the Shuttleworth Foundation, and a lot of the development on the editor was funded through the Shuttleworth Foundation, a really cool organization that supports people with interesting ideas around open. So they also have an application process. If anybody's out there and is interested, go look it up. It's a great place to work with.
Indeed. And Ross, because you said a few moments ago that you're looking for more assistance, more development, what in particular are you looking for? Do you have good internationalization support, for example? Do you have good testing already in place? And what other kinds of people are you looking for?
Right. I've recently, one of our developers has really given me the testing bug. So most of our new code does have pretty good tests in place, particularly the Python stuff. The JavaScript stuff a little bit less so. How exactly you do test-driven development in the browser is kind of interesting. So people who want to work front-end in single-page app land with JavaScript, we could always use more help with that. We have Python backend code. The database stuff we're pretty well covered on, but some of the things like we have a system for that actually needs to generate all the PDFs and EPUBs asynchronously, because you don't want to click publish. I've made some spelling changes in my 6,000 page book, and now I have to sit and wait for the PDF to generate. So we need a queue system and all of that. We have one, but it needs rewriting. We're in the process of doing that. As Kathy said, the editor already has a community around it, and we need to keep extending that and expanding it. So come to the GitHub pages and email us, open up issues, and just start fixing things. Testing is always good.
And for internationalization and translation, do you have is it all English so far, or is there some stuff that's actually been done about that?
Yeah, we have plans. Right now it's all English. We were just speccing the scale for new translation into Polish. Someone was interested in having the site completely converted. Our content is international. You can put any language in you want, but the site itself needs some internationalization. Because we're using standard libraries and things, the hooks are there. We just need to fill them in.
Okay, cool. Well, again, like I said, running out of time, but is there anything I haven't asked, or we haven't asked, that you want to make sure our audience is aware of?
I think we've pretty well covered it. How about you, Kathy?
Yeah.
We do our job. This is not my first show. I've done this before.
No,
okay.
Not.
They let me keep coming back to the big mic, so that's the important part. So I have two questions I have to ask every guest. If you've listened to any of the previous shows, you know what they are. But I'll start first with Ross. What's your favorite scripting language?
Well, you heard me say Python a few times.
I know.
So Python, and I'm afraid it's VI too. I tried Emacs a couple times, and it just didn't fit the way I think.
Lost on both sides of that equation. And Kathy, same questions.
Okay, well, I'm going to do the editor question, and I've been using Sublime Text Editor, so no high-powered GUI. But I am a manager now, and so I really don't do much scripting. My old Unix days, it was kind of the sed awk scripting and bash shells, but not really doing a lot of programming these days.
My first scripting language, believe it or not, was Tickle.
Oh yeah, the toy command language.
Mostly to get at TK, because that was the first one that had the TK toolkit. I needed to do some graphics.
I often argue that without expect and TK, we would never have heard of Tickle. Those are the two things that Tickle are actually used for. And I'm sorry, I probably just offended somebody by calling it the toy command language, but that is my name for it.
You're in big trouble.
Yeah, I'm staying out of that.
Exactly. Well, it's been wonderful having the two of you on the show today. I want to thank you for talking about the whole OpenStax project, and I know this will bring some interest of some of our audience. So thank you, Ross and Kathy, for coming on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
Very cool. That was Ross, whose name I scrolled away now, Ross Riedstrom and Kathy Fletcher, who are talking to us about OpenStax and the various things related. What do you think, Simon?
It is a very interesting project that they've got there, I think. The idea of having a lot of remixable academic content so that a professor can create a textbook that goes with the course, I think is a great idea. And they've been doing it for such a long time now. I mean, they started in 1999, and they've got a big base of content up on their website. If you look at their homepage, you see there's thousands of pages of good academic material up there. So I think it's very interesting. It's a great use of Creative Commons as well. Creative Commons levels that playing field and makes it easy for people to contribute without needing to have contributor agreements. And so I think that's very exciting as well. I'm a little surprised that they're not doing more to be multilingual and to work in other languages, because I know there's a great need in non-English speaking countries to have low-cost textbooks and free access to knowledge, both in the liberty and in the money sense. So I'm a little bit surprised about that, but very interesting project. And also I love the tech that they're using. I love the way that they're using all open source, contributing back and making their work available. It's that sort of project that makes open source so powerful, that people are motivated not by monetizing the code itself, but they have some other wealth that they're creating. As you know, this is a knowledge wealth they're creating that's motivating them to work on Aloha, that's motivating them to work on other code bases. So all around, very interesting and a good project. What did you think?
Well, Simon, you so eloquently summarized every point that I was going to make. So.
Got you.
and many beyond that, actually. So I'm glad you went first. I'll just say ditto and sheep there. Well, one of the things I saw was sort of interesting, though, is as an instructor, as a content creator, the tools that I have to do that with are clumsy at best. I'm using mostly Keynote to make my slides, but then I've got to go to something else to be able to make my show notes or my presentation notes, or just go to plain text at the bottom of the slides, which doesn't help a whole lot. And then what do I do if I want to go from there to a book? I've got to take all that content and cut and paste it and then add some more text around it. It seems to be like a crazy system here. So maybe I'll take a look at this actually as in terms of content creation and see if there's some things I can get away with this. And I know that O'Reilly, my primary publisher, is very interested also in having that kind of interface. So when we bring Simon St. Laurent on next week, maybe we can talk a little bit about that about O'Reilly's position and stuff like this. But yeah, no, this was interesting, and I'm glad they're in it, they're doing it, and they've got participation from people who don't necessarily have all the time in the world to learn a new markup language, but it seems to be working for them. So that sounds pretty good.
Yep. All good stuff. So I'm going to certainly go back and take a look at more of their content there. I'm aware of other initiatives that on a smaller scale that are trying to create OpenCourseWare, and I think it would be very good to see some bridges built to create a larger OpenCourseWare activity that's kind of like this.
Absolutely. So speaking of open content and more content available, we have still have a few shows still scheduled. What does that mean in English? I have some upcoming shows I want to talk about. God. And they still let me do this show, even as crazy as I am as I'm talking. Okay. Next week, in fact, we do have a representative from OSCON, Simon St. Laurent, who's been with O'Reilly for many, many years and is going to represent OSCON and what it's all about, and talk a little bit about the history of OSCON, of which I'm a part of, since I went all the way back to the beginning, back when it was just called the Pearl Conference. We're going to have him on next week. Now, next week's show is not going to be at the normal time. I will announce the actual time, but it might either be a little bit earlier on Wednesday or it might be one of the other days of the week, and that's because there's going to be an announcement during my normal slot next week. But watch all of our announcements, and you'll know exactly when it's going to be. We also, following that, we'll have JIT which is the Jitsi video bridge, which we had Jitsi on the show many, many years ago, or many months. Some time ago. I don't even remember. I should look that up. But this is like Google Hangouts using Jitsi, which is going to be really interesting. The Digital Public Library of America is on after that. We're going to be talking about how they're indexing all the metadata of all the archives all around the world. And so you can say search for images of California beaches, and it knows all the different places where those might be and takes you directly to the information there. And then finally, in terms of current schedule, we've got Tonica, which is a platform for social networks, for big scalable social networks. I am continuing to schedule Q2, trying to get that last bits filled in as we have some openings still. You can go to the twit.tv/floss, which is the home page for this show, and look to my big Google spreadsheet that talks all about that. You can follow us at Floss Weekly on Google+. That's probably the best place to get announcements. We also then retweet that over at Floss Weekly, all one word, on Twitter. We have a live chat. We took a couple questions from the chat this time. We're normally, again, like I said, 8:30 a.m. Pacific time on Wednesdays. Next week's show will not be at that time, but if you pay attention to the announcements, you'll know when it's going to be. You can follow me at Merlin, M-E-R-L-Y-N, on Twitter, but more likely you'll see the good content coming out on Google+. I hate saying things 140 characters at a time, so I really just sort of avoid Twitter these days. But I do have a number of followers there still, but thank you. But on Google+, I'm Randall L. Schwartz. I think I don't have anything else to plug. Simon, what do you want to plug today?
I'd love people to go visit webmink.com, my website, where I pull together all of the content that I'm working on. I've got a column in InfoWorld every Friday. I've got a column regularly appearing in Computer World in the UK. I'm now writing for Linux Voice magazine. I'm doing their news roundup every month. If you don't subscribe to Linux Voice magazine, it's a new publication all about Linux that gives back to its authors and to the community by sharing its profits with open source activities. Very well worth your time to join in if you didn't join in with the crowdfunding that got it started. So all of that writing is there if you like to read things. And I've just had a session accepted for OSCON, so it's very timely to have the OSCON show next week. I'll be going there in July. I've got a fairly light travel schedule between now and then, so I'm not going to be at very many shows. But that should mean I'll be available for some more Floss Weeklies, Randall. So
very good.
Be more available on Wednesdays over the next couple of months.
That works well for me. That's a lot of good. Also, just in the chat room, Phil Schatz in the chat room, if that's his real name, said O'Reilly is moving from DocBook to HTML book. And the HTML format we use is based on it. We, I guess, being the OpenStax people, is based on adding textbookish elements. So yeah, so I guess there's some overlap already. Boy, I put that out of the blue, and all of a sudden it's already happening. I'm either psychic or
powerful. Powerful, Randall.
Powerful. There we go. Powerful. That'll work. All right. Well, speaking of powerful, it's we're running out of time, so we'll see you all again next week on FLOSS Weekly.